To everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Gary Achel, and on behalf of the Headwaters Foundation, I want to welcome you to the third and final conversation in a series of discussions sponsored by the Headwaters Foundation focusing on the future of public education in Rappahannock County. We've done our best to use the Zoom platform to encourage participation in this evening's conversation. We'll begin in just a minute with Tim Carrington and Dr. Keith Perigin making some opening presentations. And then they'll be followed by our panelists for this evening, Miranda Hope, Betsy Dietl, and Debbie Donahue. Following their remarks, we'll use the remainder of our time, and we will be going till 8:30 this evening, so that those in the audience have an opportunity to ask questions and to offer their comments. First, though, I'd like to introduce and thank Brittany Dwyer, a Rappahannock native and product of our Rappahannock County Public Schools, who has been our Zoom administrator for these conversations, and once again this evening is helping us with tonight's meeting. So I've asked her to take just a couple of minutes to give us a short tutorial on the mechanics so everyone feels comfortable using this format. Brittany?
Thank you, Gary. It's exciting to be here tonight. So just a reminder, this is a public meeting. So we are recording this meeting. We'll be posting this on the Headwaters YouTube channel for those who cannot join us tonight. So if you would not like to be recorded, we ask that you could turn off your video, which you can do on the bottom left of your screen. It should say stop video if you would not like your picture to be shown to everyone after this meeting. I just want to let you all know that microphones are going to be muted throughout the duration of this meeting. I'm sure we've all experienced Zoom long enough to know that microphone feedback can be pretty difficult to make it to hear for the presenters and panelists. So we will be muting mics. We will be taking questions throughout this presentation tonight. So if you all have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. If we were in person, we'd be lining up behind microphones to ask our questions in order. So I'm going to be asking the questions to the panelists in the order that they are received. So please just keep that in mind. And if you could keep your questions or comments to a minimum so everyone can get a chance to ask, we would be very grateful for that. All right, I think that covered everything, Mr. Achel. I'll toss it back to you to introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Brittany. It is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters this evening. The first is Tim Carrington. He is now a local Rappahannock person, although he wasn't always somebody who lived here in Rappahannock. He's worked in journalism and economic development for over 40 years, writing for the Wall Street Journal for 15 years from New York, London, and Washington, D.C. He subsequently joined the World Bank, where he launched a training program in economics journalism for reporters and editors in Africa and the former Soviet Union. He later served as senior communications officer for the World Bank Africa region. He's the author of The Year They Sold Wall Street, published by Houghton Mifflin, also worked at McGraw-Hill Publications. His writing on development issues has appeared in The Globalist, World Paper, Enterprise Africa, and in the 2003 book, The Right to Tell, The Role of Mass Media in Economic Development. Tim grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and graduated from the University of Virginia. Go Wahoos. He and his wife, Meryl, split their time between Washington, D.C. and Washington, Virginia. He's a regular contributor to the Rappahannock News through the partnership established with the Foothill Forum, and his contributions include Protecting Paradise, Land and Landscape, a Backdrop and a Business, which was a special feature article that discussed conservation, tax, and land use issues here in Rappahannock County. Welcome, Tim. Our second presenter is Dr. Keith Perigin. Keith is in his 5th year as superintendent of Bristol, Virginia Public Schools, where the mission statement is preparing students to thrive in a dynamically changing world. He began his career in public education as a teacher at Abington High School before moving on to administrative roles as assistant principal and principal in Washington County, and then superintendent of Norton City Schools. Dr. Perigin earned a BA in history and a master's in education leadership from Radford University before completing his doctorate in educational leadership and policy at Virginia Tech. He has contributed his experience and expertise to a wide variety of state and local organizations, has been active in local Little League and Kiwanis International clubs. A founding member of the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia, he currently serves as COSAR's president. As an educator and school administrator, Keith tends to get involved on a very personal level with his work. Having made a bet with students regarding their performance on an upcoming SOL series of tests, Keith ended up joining the Army Golden Knights jump team when the students won the bet. There's still some question whether Keith jumped or was pushed out of the plane, But either way, his commitment to motivating students is impressive. Fortunately, all went well. Keith and his lovely wife of nearly 25 years, Amy, live in Bristol, and they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. As a footnote, he added, he's also a very big fan of Rappahannock Public Schools and its cheerleader-in-chief and superintendent, Dr. Shannon Grimsley. Welcome to you, Keith. Tim, you're up first.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I believe, and I hope that everybody can hear me. Thank you, Gary, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everybody who's here for coming. And I also want to thank everybody who was here the last 2 conversations, because I found them hugely educational and valuable. I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody who participated did. So this is to me been a great program to do, and I'm really honored to be a part of it in the 3rd session. So what I'm going to do is share a bit of my experience and observation as a journalist. I'm introduced beside an expert, a real expert, but I'm not sure I claim that that status here, but I'm a person who is there as a journalist asking the sorts of questions that ordinary citizens might ask as they try to make sense of a budget process and the county's effort to fund the programs it considers the highest priority. I think that because I used to write for the Wall Street Journal, people at Foothills Forum and Rappahannock News decided that I'm a numbers guy and that I should take the lead in our coverage of the county budget. I don't really love numbers, and they don't necessarily love me. But maybe because of that, I do my best to try to locate the most important numbers and see if they might tell a story or help tell a story. In this case, a story about people, particularly young people, land, and businesses. So while I'm not an expert, I'm a journalist. I'm your eyes and ears trying to make sense of a process that brings funds into the county and then disperses those funds to support the county's priorities. Looking at the Rappahannock County budget, I did what any of us might do at home. I searched for the biggest number on the spending side and the biggest number on the revenue side. On the spending side, the biggest number is the schools. It's 13.6 million in the budget proposed this spring for the fiscal year starting in July, 13.6 million. Nothing else comes close. Not the sheriff's office, not the Commonwealth's attorney, not the election board. So this tells us that education is our biggest investment, our biggest commitment, our biggest priority. We get meaningful help. In the budget proposed for the fiscal year beginning July, the county puts up $8.8 million, and the state and federal government would infuse another 4.7 million. 8.8 from the county, 4.7 from the state and federal government. Our school superintendent has become increasingly adept at identifying and tapping grants and special sources of support. And that gets the school all the way to the $13.6 million finish line. This line of the budget, the miscellaneous and the grants, is a very creative part of funding the school system. And as I said, our superintendent has led the way in helping the schools become better at this, and it's made a big difference. It's become increasingly important. Then, on the revenue side, by far, the biggest revenue source is general property taxes at 13.4 million. 13.4 million for general property taxes. Again, nothing else comes close. Not meals and lodging taxes, not sales taxes from online sales, not permits or licenses. The $13.4 million includes taxes on vehicles and private property, but also the lion's share comes from property taxes, is real estate. As Administrator Gary Curry points out, there are no large companies or big box retailers in the county. We have land, we have property, and that's the source of, in a sense, the county identity as well as the tax base. So any discussion of funding the schools and looking for future funding demands on the school requires that we look at the largest source of funding presently, and that's the property taxes, the general property taxes. But let me point to another important set of numbers. Land is the source of the single largest chunk of tax revenue, but the tax revenue raised from property is significantly affected by the use of conservation easements and land use tax deferrals. There are 136,634 acres of taxable land in Rappahannock County. And for Dr. Peregrine, we have a big hunk of the beautiful Shenandoah National Park that is in the county. So we have land there that is not, in fact, taxable, quite a lot. So it's 136,000 acres that is taxable. But of that, 363,000 acres are under land use reduced taxation. And another 33,634 acres are in conservation easement. So again, 136,000 is taxable, 83,000 is under land use, and 33,000 under conservation easement. That leaves 19,000 acres, 19,552 acres, 14% of all taxable land that is taxed at fair market value. Now, the reason for this is spelled out in the county's 2020 comprehensive plan, and it's well known. It is to, quote, to protect the agricultural sector from rising taxes created from development pressures. Outsiders have driven up real estate values in Rappahannock County, and farms would be hard-pressed to generate even a small profit if their land were taxed at fair market value. Together with zoning regulations, the conservation easements, and the land use tax deferrals have preserved a landscape that is indeed exceptional. But the county's smaller parcels, which are ineligible for these tax breaks, carry a larger share of the property tax burden than they would do if these advantages weren't so readily available or so widely used. So we have to accept that there is a complexity in balancing divergent priorities. We have a priority of supporting agriculture, open spaces, preserving the extraordinary landscape that everyone in Rappahannock County values. But we also have a priority of building an equitable system of taxation. And we have a very strong priority of educating the young people to strengthen their ability to work when they become adults and to enjoy life with others. So back to the big numbers. It's a legitimate simplification to say that we tax land in order to educate young people. Land is our special asset and education is our special commitment. Public safety, law enforcement, public administration are all critical. But in financial terms, these important services don't approach the draw on our budget that our schools do. But let me hasten to add that the numbers do not reveal a situation of an uncontrolled surge in county spending on schools. In 2014, the county spent $9.1 million for the schools, and this remained fairly steady until fiscal year 2020. And at that point, local spending began to shrink back a little bit, coming in at $8.8 million, as I noted earlier, in the budget proposed for the fiscal year beginning this July. State funds for our schools have remained fairly steady at about $2.6 million each year. Federal assistance jumps around more, but has tended to come in at about $500,000 each year, not including the 1.3 million in COVID-related commitments running through last year, this year, and the next fiscal year. But think of federal and state support as meeting about 32% of the school budget. You've heard a lot, and I think you'll hear some more about the state formula for calculating its aid to the county schools. It would be higher if it were calculated differently. But another number is changing, actually a bit more dramatically than the spending numbers, and that is the number of students, as measured by the average daily membership, which is what the state uses in its formula to calculate its levels of support. We dropped from 869 in the academic year of 2015 to 765 at the time the budget was presented this year, a 12% drop. I understand that the number right now has been updated and that it's about 780. But that raises a question, as the student population shrinks, about whether the schools are spending more per student. And it's understandable that supervisors, the Board of Supervisors has raised this question from time to time, and it's something that gets some discussion and attention. The numbers show this is the case, that spending per student rose from 11,700 per student in 2011 to 16,596 in 2021. But Mr. Curry has calculated the change adjusting for inflation using the commonly accepted consumer price index. And here it goes from 11,700 in 2011 to an inflation adjusted $14,067 in the fiscal year 2021. So that spending per student is not surging as much as it appeared to be when you have accounted for inflation. The shrinking student body is unlikely to reverse itself. Again, Rappahannock demographics tell a fairly dramatic story in their numbers. It's a story of aging, and we all seem to participate in this alarming trend. 1 out of 4 residents in Rappahannock County is 65 or older. That's considerably greater than the comparable figure in the 5 surrounding counties. And as for the state of Virginia, the state shows that 15.9% of its population is 65 or older. Another interesting statistic to me is that you cross the county line between Culpeper and Rappahannock, and it's just gotten to be an older place. The average age jumps at that line from 39 years old to 50 years old. You feel something happening just when you cross that green sign on 211. That's what it is. Now let's look at those people who do the most procreating. Those are people between the ages of 25 and 39. And this population dropped from 1,386 in 1980 to 980 in 2010. The 2020 numbers from the census are not yet available. But this shows a pretty significant and long-term trend demographically that isn't going to change quickly, if it changes at all. And in all likelihood, we're looking at smaller schools than we knew in the county 10 years ago. Educators point out that while smaller schools may bring in less support from the state and federal government than larger schools, they have potential advantages. Smaller classes mean that teachers may be more likely to notice and to respond to an individual student's difficulties, whether academic, social, or emotional. Private schools attract families willing to pay high tuitions to assure that their children have a place in a smaller classroom. So in some ways, this can be an opportunity. The provision of a quality education is always a choice. In my work at the World Bank, I was fascinated in some studies that were done that showed that even low-income places, when they invested in education and health, they might pass far richer countries with a greater life expectancy. The Indian state of Kerala made critical investments in education and health, and they showed a significantly longer life expectancy than that of more economically successful countries such as Brazil and South Africa. The same pattern was true of Sri Lanka: lower income, but higher educational investment and longer lives. Let me point to a more recent and quite disturbing book whose findings speak to the value of education and the risks of neglecting education, or the risks of education that gets cut off too soon. This is a book titled soberly, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism by Anne Case and Angus Deaton. The book explores an alarming increase in deaths among white middle-aged Americans from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease. It's an absolutely heartbreaking, tragic story. And the numbers are shocking. Perhaps the strongest single factor determining whether someone is part of this saddening statistic was education. Looking at that happy period that we now call pre-pandemic, 2017, the authors of this book found that at that time, 84% of Americans aged 25 to 64 with a college degree were employed, while only 68 of those with only a high school degree were employed. So more than 1 out of 4 of this category, only a high school degree, was outside the labor force. That number is, of course, greater today. Life is becoming more difficult for less educated citizens. In some cases, it's becoming impossible. Looking at people in Kentucky between the ages of 45 and 54 without post-high school education, the authors found that deaths from suicide, overdose, and alcoholic liver disease more than tripled between 1995 and 2015. For those with a college degree, the number started much lower and changed very little in this period. Of course, here in this conversation, we're not talking about higher education, we're talking about our high school and elementary school. But education after high school depends on the experience, the motivation, the encouragement, and the confidence with which young people leave high school. To borrow a phrase heard frequently at our schools, life-ready students will locate the next possibility and figure out a way to make it happen. That's what these schools are working so hard to do, and the stakes have never been higher. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll pass things back to Gary and look forward to comments and questions and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's a sobering but serious and important look at the critical nature of education in our county. Brittany, if you have 1 or 2 questions for Tim, let's take those now.
I will, yes. And if anyone has additional questions, please just put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if we don't get to them now, we can get to them later at the end of the presentation. Tim, one of the things that you talked about earlier in your presentation was about the high percentage of acres in conservation in Rappahannock County. One of the questions that we had gotten, are there any ways Rappahannock County can compensate for the very high percentage of acres that are in conservation and land use tax abatements? in increasing funding for our schools?
Well, it's a big question and a complicated one. When land is put into conservation easement, that's a permanent thing. And I think that the county is quite reluctant to change the economics for active farmers in a way that would make it harder for them to manage in a tough business environment. But there are ideas that are being kicked around. One of them, for example, is to look at the option of open space land use. And that's something that the state of Virginia makes available to any county that chooses to employ it. Rappahannock does not at this point, but there are those in the county that feel that would be a good idea. And one of the possibilities would be that if someone chose to put land in an open space land use, which means they're not farming it, it's not forestry, but they're protecting it and they're not going to build on it, they're not going to sell it to a developer. It's just going to be a place where nature follows its way. It's a bird sanctuary. It's a place for native plants. Different people have different ideas. The tax break for that would be a lesser one than the tax break for agricultural land use. So that would be a way to both honor and protect the open landscape that Rappahannock County considers so central a part of its identity, but to lessen the hit on the taxes paid to the county and taxes that are then available for priorities like education.
Looking at the clock, thanking you for your presentation and the answer to that question. I think we'll hold additional questions for Tim until the end. We'll move on now to Dr. Keith Perigin, who has a broader view, a statewide view, as well as the view of a superintendent of a school district. Dr. Perigin.
Thanks, Gary. And I think I've changed my mind after hearing Tim speak. He's got me so fired up about the antiquated funding mechanism that the state uses to fund schools that I wish I could just change my entire topic and talk about the local composite index and the inequities that it causes. But maybe I'll save that for another night, or maybe it'll pop up in one of the questions that comes on later on. But that's certainly something that we could talk about for a good while. Gary, I appreciate the nice introduction that you gave earlier. I think it's pretty easy to tell that I'm not from your neck of the woods, just from hearing me talk just for a second. I'm from small town Southwest Virginia, and I'll tell you just very quickly, he mentioned that I'm a big fan of Dr. Grimsley. When we started our coalition a few years ago and we're recruiting other small and rural school divisions to join, when Rappahannock expressed interest, I was very surprised, because I'll tell you, Dr. Grimsley does not carry herself like a small town superintendent. She has a lot of respect throughout the Commonwealth, is she's very well looked up to and sought after for advice. And so I was really surprised that she fell into the category of being a small school division, because she certainly does not present herself that way. And I enjoy talking to Shannon and sharing advice back and forth with each other. So you're very blessed to have her in Rappahannock County. If you don't know that already, you should know that now. And so I will, as Gary said, I am the superintendent in Bristol, Virginia Public Schools. I was previously superintendent in Norton City Schools, which is a small school division in Southwest Virginia in the middle of the coal fields, which is about the same size as Rappahannock. And that is actually, I was superintendent there when the coalition of small and rural schools was built or was developed. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just a second. If Gary, if you'll nod, if you can see my screen there. So, all right, excellent. So again, I am the president and one of the founding members of the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia. We are the Virginia affiliate of the National Rural Education Association. We're about 4 years old, almost 5 years old now, and we have grown a great deal over those 5 years. I'll tell you how our origin happened. In 2015 and 16, 7 school divisions in Southwest Virginia, and these were really the coal fields of Southwest Virginia. Norton was one of those where I was the superintendent. We lost, during the course of the year, we lost 274 students. And that, that doesn't sound like a lot of students over 7 school divisions, but all of the school divisions in Southwest Virginia are very, very small, much like Rappahannock. Some the size of Rappahannock and Norton, and some a little larger. But then the following, from that May, when that school year ended, until the next school year began in August of 2016, those same 7 school divisions lost another 644 students. And I'm going to say this from memory, but I think that ended up being almost 8% of our student body in those 7 school divisions we lost from one school year until the next. And, as you know, school budgets are built the year before the fiscal year starts. And so you build those budgets based on what you think the enrollment estimates will be. And it is very clear to us in Southwest Virginia back in 2016 that our estimates were going to be way off. And there's no way to adjust those estimates after the school year has started, because contracts with teachers have already been signed. And 75 to 80% of all of our budgets are tied up in personnel and benefits. And so we were all panicking about not having a balanced budget for the year because of the number of students we had lost and the huge impact that our average daily membership has on the funds that we have. And so, being a small school division in Norton, I knew that I could whine and complain about that all that I wanted, and the folks in Richmond probably wouldn't hear much of what I had to say. So I started calling some of my friends and realized that they were having the same issues and concerns. And so 7 school divisions at that point came together, and we decided that we were going to incorporate the Coalfields Coalition. And that was 7 school divisions there in 2016. We held a meeting at the University of Virginia at Wise. We invited local leaders, school board members, boards of supervisors, local delegates and senators, business leaders, and we came to the convocation center there, and we just kind of laid out the issues that we were having. And we came together over a few topics. And number one, we wanted to establish a regional voice. I knew as superintendent of Norton that I could share my concerns in Richmond and not have a very large voice. But by combining together with 6 other school divisions, we thought that we could increase our voice. We also, at the same point in time, we wanted to have a voice, but we wanted to make sure that we engaged and educated and brought together our communities so that they could assist us in the advocacy efforts that we knew that we would need to help make our school division successful. And so the first thing that we had to do was to acknowledge the challenges that we had. And for us, it was very much like what Rappahannock is experiencing now. It was that enrollment decline. We also recognized that there were state funding discrepancies, and that localities in our neck of the woods, at least, were really struggling. What happened, the reason that we lost so many students in those coalfield school divisions at one time is 2 very large coal companies in that area closed down. And so over the summer, those families couldn't find work and they relocated. And there was no way that we could anticipate that we would lose that many students as a result of that, but that was indeed what happened. But I know you folks in Rappahannock are good, solid, salt of the earth people who, whenever problems come, you just roll up your sleeves and get to work. And so that's what we did in Southwest Virginia too. We didn't just want to whine and cry about the problems we were having. We also wanted to provide solutions and use that regional voice to help solve them. And so what we did that night with the support of our community is we proposed a plan of action, and we took that plan of action to policymakers. And I will tell you, in our first year, enrollment loss was the topic of conversation from almost all of our meetings. As we started to have those conversations, we started to hear from our colleagues in Southside Virginia, and they were experiencing the same decline in enrollment. It was for different reasons. The industry they were losing was not coal, but they were certainly losing students. And so the next thing you know, that ball starts rolling and we start picking up momentum, and more school divisions start to join. But in that first year, just with those 7 school divisions coming together and bringing our voice together, we were able to have a $13 million impact on the state budget, $6 million in the first year of the biennium and $7 million in the second year of the biennium. All of that money was for enrollment loss. It didn't just help school divisions in Southwest Virginia, it helped school divisions all across rural Virginia. And again, that's another way that our momentum began to build. But part of those funding challenges that we were talking about as a Coalfields Coalition, that I also heard Tim talking about in his presentation, is state funding. The state average for per pupil expenditures in the Commonwealth of Virginia is $11,560. In Bristol, our per pupil expenditure, average per pupil expenditure, is almost $9,700. In Rappahannock, you guys are below the state average as well at $11,400. Norton, where I came from before Bristol, Norton is only able to spend $8,500 per pupil every year. However, if you look at more suburban and affluent areas, there's a much different story to be told. I don't mind to share data about members of our coalition, and I'll call them by name, but you'll notice I have Division A and Division B listed because, you know, those school divisions are not members of our coalition of small or rural schools. That's because they're large and affluent and suburban divisions. But because of the differences in localities and state funding formula, those divisions are spending above $19,000 in some cases and above $20,000 per pupil in some cases. And so as we talk about equitable funding, it's very easy to see that in a division like Division A, where you're spending more than $20,000 per student, and a division like Rappahannock or a division like Bristol and Norton, where you're still under the entire state average, state funding for per pupil is very inequitable. And so that is kind of our cause as a coalition, is every year we focus on some portion of the state budget to try to make state funding for public education more equitable, especially for small and rural schools. So just a little more about our school division. I mentioned the local composite index earlier. That is the local composite index. You may not know very quickly. It's based on the largest portion of the local composite index comes from real property values in your locality. That's 50% of the equation. 40% of that equation comes from the gross income, average gross income of folks that live in your community. And then 10% of that local composite index comes from your local sales tax. And then all those numbers are brought together in that formula, and they divide it by the number of students in your school division. And then they also divide it by the number of folks who live in your community. And then that's how they determine how much state funding they will provide for each locality and how much the locality will be required for. Well, out of the school divisions that make up our coalition, of the 20 that have the lowest LCI, which means, you know, the highest poverty, 15 of those members are members of our coalition. And 13 of those divisions receive less than 30% above the legal minimum, which is required local effort. The state average is 113% more than what they're required to give. So localities across the Commonwealth are required to give X number of dollars, and the average across the Commonwealth is 113% more. Well, 6 of the divisions who are members of our coalition receive less than 12% above the legal minimum. So they're right, and Bristol actually we fell below that this past year, but we're making it work regardless. In contrast to that, some school divisions that have the highest LCI, which is 0.8 is the highest LCI, they invest over 180% above the legal minimum. Now, you may know that Rappahannock, because of some property values that Tim mentioned earlier, Rappahannock has a very high LCI too, but because they don't have the ability to tax land like other localities have to tax the property that they have in their Commonwealth, Rappahannock provides 83% above the legal required minimum, which sounds high as compared to the rural schools in Southwest Virginia. But whenever you compare it to other localities with the high LCI, it's one of the lowest as far as the Rappahannock is in the middle of the lowest local investors at 83% above. And that's still far below the state average of the ability to fund above the state required minimum. So What has happened with the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools over the last 4 or 5 years? We started out with 7 small school divisions from Southwest Virginia. Currently, we now have 80 members. As you can see from the map that is on your screen, our member divisions make up well over half of the land mass of the Commonwealth. We make up well over half of the total number of school divisions. There are 132 school divisions in the Commonwealth. Unfortunately, we make up a very small portion of the total student population because most of the student population in Virginia reside in just a few localities. I mentioned to you earlier that in that first year, we had our advocacy efforts had a $13 million impact on the state budget. That was in enrollment loss. And then the following year, we had a $36 million impact because of our advocacy towards the at-risk add-on. The at-risk add-on basically gives school divisions additional funding for every student that they have in their division that qualifies for free or reduced price lunch. At the time, somewhere between 1 and 13% above the state per pupil amount was given to every student that had would qualify for free or reduced price lunch. And we were able that year to get that cap raised up to 16. The following year, the at-risk add-on was increased by another 69 million, and we got the cap raised up to 22 that year. However, COVID hit very soon after we had that success, and so that was taken away. And we had also got some $4 million more for enrollment loss that following year. That was taken away as well. Thankfully, after the new revenue projections came out, the at-risk add-on increase was reinstated. However, the enrollment loss funding was not reinstated. So we have had some success by, instead of one school division from Norton expressing a concern to Richmond, we started with 7. And now when we speak in legislative committees or to the governor, to the Secretary of Ed or other decision makers, we have the power of 80 school divisions behind us. Another success that we had when casinos come online across the Commonwealth, any state revenue that's generated from that, the local revenue will stay in the localities, but the state revenue will all be set aside to school infrastructure. School infrastructure, because of our advocacy efforts, it's part of the legislative conversation. It's part of the gubernatorial races that you're hearing. It's part of Senate and delegate races. If there is going to be a hot topic this upcoming election cycle in regards to public education, I think it's going to be teacher salaries and school infrastructure. Another success that we had is, for the first time, a lot of folks are afraid. If you're a very affluent large school division, you're afraid to mess with the LCI because you're afraid that it may cause you to get even less state funding than you're already getting. And if you're a very high poverty school division like Lee County or Scott County, who have LCIs below 0.2, they're afraid that they will lose state funding if you mess with the LCI. But there are some school divisions out there like Rappahannock that could really benefit if the LCI was not the main formula used to fund public education. And so one of the successes that we had this year is, for the first time, they added additional categories to the at-risk add-on, which gives additional funding to school divisions who have students who qualify for free or reduced price lunch. We are frequently asked to testify on bills and also to support legislation. And the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools, we now have a seat at the table that would not be possible if we were advocating as individual school divisions. And so finally, according to the Virginia Education Association, you probably know this, Virginia is the 12th wealthiest state in the United States of America. Unfortunately, we rank 42nd when it comes to education spending, and even worse when it comes to teacher pay. We can do better. We know that we can do better. And in order for Virginia to provide equitable learning experiences, regardless of a student zip code, we must do better. And so that is my presentation. If anybody wants to stick around after 8:30 and talk about the local composite index, I've got a few extra hours on my hands. But Gary and folks, everybody, I appreciate the opportunity to share with the foundation tonight.
Thank you very much, Keith. Brittany, let's just take one question for Keith now so we can get to our panelists.
We do have one question from Miss Eve Brooks. I'm going to unmute her to ask her question to you. And she just went away in the chat. Let me bring her back up. Okay, Eve, I'm asking to unmute you if you could ask your question.
Yes, I unfortunately, I wanted to ask for a little bit more information about when the LCI will be revised. And I also want to talk about the opportunities that might be more coming up in working on the at-risk formula. And with that, I mute myself.
Ms. Brooks, thanks for your question. The LCIs that we currently have will be in place through this next fiscal year. They'll be reevaluated, and this upcoming December we'll get our new numbers, and those will go into effect for the next biennium. The at-risk add-on will continue to be an advocacy point of emphasis for our coalition. I think, you know, we were the national average for at-risk add-on. It's called something different in every state, but the national average is 29%. And when Virginia was at 13% as a cap, that was a very easy advocacy point. Now that we've got to 26% as our cap, I think that's very comparable. I think our focus from this point forward will be to take more categories out of the composite index formula and get those moved over to the at-risk add-on formula.
Thank you very much. If we can unshare the screen and we'll move on to Miranda, who I know has her own presentation. We're fortunate tonight to have three outstanding local folks who are obviously interested and concerned about public education and have agreed to respond briefly to our presenters, and then we'll move on to opening questions and comments from the participants. Our first panelist is Miranda Hope. Miranda has lived in Rappahannock on and off since 1997. She taught drama and chorus at Rappahannock Public Schools for 3 years and then founded and served as director of Headwaters Next Step College and Career Counseling Advising Program. Her son Kai has attended Rappahannock Elementary School for the past 5 years. Miranda has taught therapeutic yoga and meditation to thousands of wounded warriors and incarcerated men and women, and more recently to hundreds of members of the Rappahannock community through the Commit to Be Fit program at Rappahannock Public Schools. She also has a long history of working with nonprofits dedicated to easing the desperation of those living in poverty, and currently serves as secretary of the board for the Child Care and Learning Center. Miranda has a BA in English from Stanford University and an MFA from Columbia University. She's currently working toward a master's in social work through George Mason University. A writer, musician, singer, songwriter, and a performer, Miranda performs locally with the Shinola Creek Collective, that might be Shinola Creek Collective, and appeared in 2019 on the Charlottesville TEDx stage, giving a talk called One Friend on the hilarity and heartbreak of raising a child with autism. She lives with her husband, Drew, and her son, Kai, a beloved old dog, and at least 3 deer, 3 ground dog, 15 squirrels, and 17 turkeys in Washington, Virginia. And I found out tonight she's a neighbor. She just lives up the road off the fodder stack. So Miranda, welcome. I think what we'll do is let you do your presentation and then I'll introduce the next panelist. So Miranda, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen and then you can let me know if you can see it. Okay,
That's
great.
great.
So, well, thank you so much. I just love how this community comes together on panels like this one to try to make a difference. So I wanted to read this quote. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. This is in reference to the environment or the ecosystem. This is a forestry engineer saying this, but I think it applies to our schools because when I think we just need incentives for how to get people not just to know about our schools, but to love them. And I think that's actually why I'm on this panel tonight, is because I love our schools. And so first, I looked at a study of, it closed a rural school in Canada just to see what happens when you close a rural school. And one thing, the relationships in the community shift. We lessen well-being. And I was so interested that Mr. Carrington talked about well-being. Well-being is a really critical a measure of health disparity. When we take away someone's well-being, when we take away their gathering place, when we take away their sense of control, we can take away their health, mental and physical. So when we close rural schools, we can decrease residents' sense of community and their civic engagement, can disconnect families and communities, disconnect children and other family members as children spend their time driving or on buses, going to other schools. We reduce opportunities to work, to volunteer, to gather, to connect, and to socialize. And with this, closing a school can lead to our resources, our money, our people, our energy flowing out to other communities. Can lead to children sleeping less, waking earlier, commuting for hours, foregoing opportunities for extracurricular activities because they have to get on the afternoon bus to come home, and losing some of their rural identity. And we can, sometimes when you close a rural school, you reduce the number of gathering and meeting spaces, and such as the community exercise classes I teach for Commit to Be Fit, athletic events, fundraisers, performances. In previous panels, it was Missy McCool, I think, that said that it's just, a school is the heart of the community. And if you get rid of it, you not only lose people and ship your kids away, there's something that happens to the fabric of a community when you do that. And I think it's important to remember that it won't be free to send hundreds of children to other schools. It will still be expensive. So with that in mind, I thought of myself first as a teacher, because in 2000, I was hired to teach yoga. I mean, I didn't teach some yoga, but drama and chorus at the Rappahannock County High School and chorus at the elementary school. And what I saw were really innovative programs in this small, nimble environment with invested teachers and a diverse student body. It is not diverse, you wouldn't say it's diverse racially, but in terms of socioeconomics, it is a diverse environment. And I was really interested in to see Michelle Fincham's Animal and Ag program, the hands-on learning, the career and technical education that they are promoting at the high school. And then Jenny Capsa talked about her Life Ready programs, Profile of a Graduate, and the social and emotional learning, and the support that's being provided for students going on to college and career and trade schools. And then the summer camp and the Wonderful Wednesday, those are programs that showed up during COVID. And it's just what you can do with this nimble, small school. You see a problem and yes, sorry, I heard someone talking. You see a problem and you can gather people and fix it. And we see that over and over again in the public schools. I'm thinking about Bev Hunter, who's a cherished member of our community, who passed away several years ago, but she came in, she wanted to teach GIS to anybody that wanted to learn it. That's a global mapping system. 4 students signed up, and in 3 months, they won the state competition for GIS. Dave Nazer takes kids to quiz bowl tournaments, and he's been doing that for decades, and they frequently win or place. And in my own drama class, I had such a mix of students. You know, sometimes they go on to be actresses. One went on to be a New York actress. But then there was a guy who he farmed and he hunted and he had no interest in being in a drama class. But I asked him to show me something, teach me something without any words. And I'll never forget how this young man got up on stage and in 10 minutes told me how to process a deer and how to deal with the skin and the fur and to cut it. And then to cut that little bit off the heel, you have to do that because otherwise the meat can be poisoned. And it was so beneficial to me to be in that diverse environment. And I think it was beneficial to the students as well. And then in my chorus, again, with diversity, I had a nonverbal special needs child in my chorus. And I also had one of the best sopranos in the state. And that kind of mixing is just so rare. And I know my data is now ancient, my experience, but I think it's still the case. So, and then as a counselor, I started and founded with the help of Headwaters and the school system, the Next Step College Counseling and Career Access Program. And I just want to tell you the story of some of these kids, because I think if we don't really learn and understand who these kids are, we can't love our schools like I do. So first, Justin, he needed to start paying bills at home, and his small engine repair teacher, John Norman, found him a job working as an underbridge access welder 40 hours a week while he was taking a full load of college prep classes. Justin is my hero. And then another young man, Jesse, he took the cabinetry and the culinary classes, but he also took AP classes. And he wrote his college essay on photography and on the silo that is really a cell tower. And this is Jesse and his mom and I out at Stanford, because he did get into Stanford. And when we showed up there, the admissions officer came out, welcomed Jesse, and quoted his essay to him there in the lobby. And this is Rappahannock. This is what's possible. Next, Osha. She waitressed 40 hours a week at the Blue Rock while attending college level courses at the Governor's School. And she also went on to Stanford. And both Jesse and Osha felt prepared to take classes at Stanford. And Jesse went on to work for NASA, and Osha went on to work for startup tech in Silicon Valley. Next, Natalie. I just want to talk about Natalie. I don't have a picture of her, but she's just a fantastic young woman. And she wrote her essay about wanting to be a speech language pathologist, which she now has a master's in, because she sat next to a nonverbal student in her keyboarding class. And again, the mix, the diversity, the individual attention. And then, of course, all of the hundreds of young people who became mechanics and farmers and carpenters and nurses, landscapers, business owners, mothers and fathers, and good citizens here and elsewhere, perhaps better for having spent time in a place where it's harder to fall through the cracks. And then finally, as a parent, I almost want to apologize to all the parents I worked with before. I had no idea what I was talking about. Once you have a kid, it's completely different. And some people get handed a child who's, you know, kind of like a 40-year-old executive. They just sit and they do what they're told. Me, I got handed this. And Kai started off over in La Jolla, California, and he was in a 10 out of 10 great schools school. And it was a terrible fit for him. It was the worst habitat. I got calls every other week that they just couldn't handle this, and I had to come and pick him up. He had a full-time aide. He had all kinds of supports and therapies, and still they couldn't handle it. And they even suggested that he go to a school for emotionally disturbed children, and just bless all of those people in those schools that work with that population. But we decided, no, we're going to come back to Rappahannock and try this out. So we took a tour around Rappahannock Elementary, where I taught chorus 15 years before. And I wasn't sure if it was going to work out. I wasn't sure if it was going to be a good fit. But I'm walking down the hall, and here comes Barbara Wheatley out of the library, Miranda. And I'm like, wait a second, I actually know people in this building. And I worked with her daughter, and both for college and for plays. And then here comes Candy Lama. I worked with her daughter, and I'm getting hugs as I'm walking down this building, filled with uncertainty, but less and less so. And here comes Bobby Glasker, and he's like, Hope, bring it in. And I'm like, okay, I think this could work. And then we meet some of the teachers that Kai will have, and they're just bright lights, hardworking, ready to roll up their sleeves and handle anything. And in 5 years there, I haven't received one call that they can't handle it. So, in fact, here's a picture of Mrs. Dippert. Kai is the kid right here in the green shirt in the middle. Of course, she's a genius. She stuck him right in the middle of all the other kids so he can't act up. But they're handling it. And he feels loved, and he feels welcome. And there on the first day of school, I remember I'm walking in, again, I'm nervous. I'm not sure this is going to work out. And I hear Karen Ellis on the loudspeaker, and she goes, Mr. Scroggins, please report to the flagpole with the bucket. And I'm looking around, I'm like, what's going on? And she comes out and she says, there's a snake, and I don't want my kindergartners to be scared on the first day of school. And then here's Lilo Wolf, who I also have known for decades, and she's directing traffic, and she says, well, it's better than last year when it was a bear. So yeah, I'm just like, we're not in La Jolla anymore. We are in a very special place that's going to suit us just fine. So And I also wanted to say, Kai, my son, he still gets hugs from his first grade teacher, even though he's going into sixth grade. And just last Friday, he spent time with his second grade reading teacher. And it's just this community, this support, this love, this concern, this care that is rare in a larger school and maybe rare in an urban school. And so I'll just say in conclusion, when we fund and save our local public school, we're choosing more than a school, we're choosing to enable this rare, small, nimble, innovative, full of heart and full of possibility organization to thrive. We are choosing diversity and inclusion over separation and dilution. And we are choosing the well-being of our whole community. It's hard to put numbers to it. It's hard to quantify this. But as Mr. Carrington said, well-being is a critical aspect of a community. And we are choosing the ability for middle and low income working families to continue to live and raise their children in Rappahannock. And I believe that we are choosing to protect an extraordinary habitat by caring about it, understanding it, and learning and loving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I think we'll go to our next, which is Betsy, but first, Gary is going to introduce her.
Yes, our second panelist is Betsy Dietl, known to many of us on this call. She's a senior partner with Dietl and Partners, a family-to-family philanthropic advising firm that she began with her father, Bill, and sister 13 years ago in Flint Hill. DNP has since grown and is now a woman-owned business with virtual offices in Maine, Virginia, and the state of Washington. Having worn many hats, volunteer, board member, development officer, and executive director for a variety of nonprofits, Betsy is well acquainted with what it is like to have to ask for and raise money for a good cause. Regardless of whether it was helping to raise money or give money away, Betsy's work has reflected an unwavering commitment to building strong, resilient, sustainable communities, be they urban, suburban, or rural. For the past decade, Betsy and her husband, Mike, have lived at Over Jordan Farm in Wakefield District of Rappahannock County. Home to Bean Hollow Grass-Fed, she occasionally gets recruited to help herd disobedient livestock and bottle feed orphaned lambs. Betsy and Mike have 2 sons and 3 independent, awesome granddaughters, ages 1 to 11. Welcome, Betsy. You have to unmute, Bets.
Number one, thank you, Gary, and thank you to all the panelists, both tonight and on the other 2 panels. I think this has been an amazing series and a very rich conversation, and I suspect it will go on for months more. But I'm going to sort of cut to the chase because I know we're short on time, and I think the most important piece of this evening is really having questions and answer. I just want to I've taken some quick notes, bulleted some things, and I'd like to just say, first of all, to Keith's point, there is strength acknowledged, and I think this is one of the most difficult things to do as a group, as a community. We've acknowledged that this is a very complicated and pressing challenge. There's no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet to this issue of how do we get more equitable funding and how do we get more funding. This is a complicated issue, and as Tim so eloquently described, and I think this is going to take a lot more digging deeper into the details, into the information, doing much more analysis of what is actually going on at the local and the regional and the state level, and thinking about how we can all come together to solve this problem. This is going to require a multi-pronged approach, I believe. I believe we've got some wonderful elements that are already showing what can happen. From the philanthropic side, I think we are exemplary in terms of the programs and the money that we've attracted and the variety of money and the kinds of collaborations, and we can do more of that. But philanthropy cannot keep the lights on. It cannot replace existing public funds. It's the seed funding for doing really innovative, interesting work, but we need to get to the heart of the issue, which is where the actual largest chunk of the funding comes from and how we can grow that pot. Finally, I think we also need to build a very broad coalition, and we've begun that. We've done that in a number of instances in the last year as a result of COVID. I think we've got a good foundation, but that coalition is going to have to include parents and grandparents and taxpayers and teachers and children. Frankly, we got to involve the kids in this because this is their future, and they should have a seat at the table. So finally, I think Miranda just summarized why all of this is worth fighting for. So thank you for doing this tonight, Gary and Headwaters, and let's get on with some questions after Debbie gives us some words of wisdom. Thank you.
Gary, you're muted. I'm going to unmute you.
I'm trying. All right, there we go. It turns out that the tech has more authority than the host, which is probably the way it should be. Our final presenter is well known to many of us and is certainly to her constituents. Debbie Donahue, after purchasing land and just falling in love with Rappahannock County in 1997, moved with her husband Jim to live here permanently in 2000. Both had worked for Capital One and frankly were ready to start out on a new adventure. They purchased the historic Bradford House in Flint Hill, and after complete renovation, opened the Griffin Tavern in 2003, known to many of us. Modeled in an old English pub, this much-needed social gathering place quickly became a favorite with those living in Rappahannock County and a very popular destination for those just visiting. In addition to creating a successful business together, Debbie and Jim built their new home in Rappahannock County. Working with local builder Don Chapman, they created the log home of their dreams. Sits on rolling hills surrounded by mountain views, a custom-built rural retreat that happily became their home for them and for their canine companions, and they've been there for 20 years. With an educational background in business, Debbie also holds a certificate in food service management from Cornell University. Past chair of the Virginia Hospitality and Travel Association, she is the current chair of the Lord Fairfax Community College Foundation, and she was elected in 2020 from Wakefield District and now currently serves as chair of the Rappahannock County Board of Supervisors. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you very much. And I really didn't understand why I was being asked to be on this panel because I don't have children. But everybody laughs and says, well, you have 24 that work for you. And I said, okay, that makes sense. Maybe I do have some knowledge about children in Rappahannock County. Luckily, so many of them have come to work for us throughout the years and have great stories of the hardest working dishwasher that I know now does nails in Sperryville. Katie did a wonderful job, and I tell all the guys in the dish room they have something to live up to there. But I really want to say thank you for this three conversations that have occurred, because I think one, we're really giving people, the citizens of Rappahannock County, more knowledge than they probably ever had with regards to the school system and the pros and cons of being in a rural community. I think what this has done is it's really made me feel like we've got a plan for the future. Any business does. And, you know, I've heard schools talking about going 365 days a year. Well, now we don't need snow days because you've got Zoom. There's all kinds of technology changes that are coming. And I think the more conversations we can have and be able to plan ahead for these changes that are going to occur, the better. The COSAR's presentation, I find what they are doing very interesting, because personally, I think if there isn't one, we should have a rural coalition of counties, because what happens in rural counties is just different from Fairfax and Virginia Beach and Richmond. I think if we can, I don't want to say get away from the LCI formula, but if we can find other ways, like they've done recently with the, I think it was the infrastructure and operations per pupil, where they actually had the amount of money received couldn't go below $200,000. That, to me, if we can find more opportunities within the state or federal level that we can set the lowest bar, is still something that's going to help the rural rural communities. I think that's something we should really try to focus on as much as we can. But I think growing up in Rappahannock County is amazing. Having a school that gets you prepared for a 4-year or more degree afterwards, or with LFCC just around the corner, and you can take heavy equipment courses. You can go through that. I think it's like 6 months and come out running a large piece of equipment for a pretty good chunk of change. I saw a signing they did like a football player gets, except these gentlemen were signing with construction companies that are just dying for employees. So we have a lot to offer in our area, and I'm so thankful that this community really cares about the children, the viewshed, the whole picture of Rappahannock County, and the events that the Taste of Rappahannock does, Headwaters does, CCLC does. I don't know if you remember the calendar that was a huge success for the track, but also it got Good Morning America here because the men in the calendar were nude. And it's those kind of events that we have, or fundraisers that we do, that make us different, make it special. And I don't believe the larger communities can put things together like that, that really impact our community the way we do it here. But like Mrs. Deedle said, you cannot expect a calendar to pay the big bills. And so we've got to look at other ways to get money from the state and federal for our school and our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you again to everyone who has presented or responded to the presenters as panelists. Headwaters thanks everyone who's on this call. And I will say, taking a page from Mr. Peregrina's comments, we don't have to cut this off exactly at 8:30 if there's people who still want to stay around and chat a bit longer. We won't go beyond 8:45, but let's start now. And Brittany would help us field questions. She has some in the chat, but she's probably able to take some from the floor, the virtual floor. So Brittany, let's start hearing some questions and comments.
Absolutely. I have a couple, and if people have some more, please drop them in the chat as I'm asking these. The conversation has been great tonight, and I think the panelists and presenters have made a lot of great points about our school system. And so one of the questions is, do you have any recommendations or suggestions for how Rappahannock County Public Schools can do a better job of promoting the advantages of a small rural school district? You know, things like smaller class size, more personalized instruction, or those greater opportunities for students to really succeed, like we talked about, like Miranda had said. So any panelist or presenter want to take a stab at that one?
Brittany, you might want to go ahead and unmute all of the both presenters and the three panelists so that we have a little bit more seamless conversation.
Yes, and they should be able to unmute.
Brittany, I don't know how this would go over in Rappahannock and with your neighbors there, but when I was superintendent in Norton, we really tried to recruit folks there because enrollment was so important to us. For some families, we had some kind of grant that we were able to provide gas cards. So we provided gas cards for families who lived out of district to bring their children in for specific programs that we had. And then we actually had a bus driver who lived in a neighboring county, and he took his bus home with him, and anybody from that county who was on the way in, he would pick them up because they had a desire to take advantage of a specific program or a smaller class size. An interesting tidbit along those lines, our elementary and middle school was a newer building. And so what we found in Norton is that we had a lot of families from Wise County who would come to our elementary school, but their high school was an aging building that couldn't compete with the new high schools that they had built in the county. And so we would keep students through 8th grade. And then whenever it came time to go to the high school, they would transfer back to their location. That's probably not going to be a game changer for you guys in Rappahannock, but those are some things that occur in Southwest Virginia.
It's a good thought. We lose workers every morning who migrate out of the county to our 5 surrounding counties. So We just happen to be a county that exports people to jobs outside of the county. There's no reason why people outside the county couldn't import students if we can make our schools attractive enough. So that's something to think about. Next question.
All right, I didn't know if any other panelists had any other thoughts on that one before we moved on. I saw a couple people unmute.
I wanted to just say that when Miranda used the word a couple of times, nimble, I think it's hugely important. I think it's really interesting. And I think that any occasion where we can flesh that out, we can show what that really means. We can show how that happened for a particular student. And some of her stories began to do that, but I would love to learn more about that. And I think that's a key thing to really flesh out over time.
Thanks, Tim.
I also think that this is a role that philanthropy can play in terms of helping get those stories out. It's a perfect place for putting some philanthropic dollars. And I think it could go a long way in terms of I think we've sort of discovered in the last couple of weeks that there's a lot going on in this district that a lot of us have no idea of. And so we've got to get the word out.
One other idea that I would throw out there that we're doing, we've created because of COVID and virtual learning, we've 14 school divisions down here have come together to create a regional virtual academy so that we don't have to do all that work on our own. And we're really using that to try to re-recruit our homeschool students who may not want to come into our buildings, but who may want to take advantage of the state aligned curriculum that we provide in a virtual. So we've sent out our promotional flyers to those families, trying to get them back in.
Thank you. All right, the next question involves the teacher compensation. And so one of the questions is, are there effective strategies for small rural districts like Rappahannock to keep pace with larger, better funded districts when it comes to teacher salaries? How can we compete with some of the larger, well-funded districts like Arlington and Fairfax that are right next door? I don't know, Dr. Perigin, if you have thoughts about that, since you might have dealt with that a time or two, or other panelists or presenters.
Well, I would just say we started working on it in Norton before I left, and they have accomplished it now. And we have done it in Bristol since I've been there. We just removed any fluff, anything in our budget that we could get rid of, and we put it all towards salaries and benefits. And we were one of the lowest paying school divisions in our region, and now we're among the highest at most steps. We just made that a priority and just said, the most important thing that we can do for our students is to have great staff, recruit great staff, retain great staff. And so that's just been our focus. It's, we don't have a lot of money, but every penny that we get, we try to put it towards staff.
Thank you. Thoughts from any of the other panelists or presenters about that question? How small rural school districts compete with larger, well-funded districts like Arlington and Fairfax?
I will just say, having sat through a school board meeting where Dr. Grimsley made a full presentation on this, they've been working on the scale and readjusting some of the steps. Typically, older, more veteran teachers make more money, which then means you have less in your pot to attract new, younger teachers. So they've been paying a lot of attention in the last year to adjusting where they can and taking advantage of the fact that you can see it as an unfortunate consequence of aging that we're having more teachers who are retiring. Or you could say that, in fact, while we will miss them and we will miss their experience, their expertise, and all the relationships, it does mean that you can now bring more money to the front end. So I know that the school board has been working very diligently with limited funds to get the biggest bang for the buck out of every dollar that goes for instructional expenses. So that is one thing that Rappahannock has begun to do. Obviously, it's still tough when you have so few overall dollars to spread around all the needs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Putting money at the front of the scale is a lot cheaper than putting money at the top of the scale. And if you don't have a lot of money, that's an easy, quick fix.
Wonderful. All right. We'll move on to another question. So even though Rappahannock may be a wealthy county, if you only look at the fair market value of real estate and average personal income, A significant percentage of our students come from families that are not wealthy and in fact have pretty great need. Is there any way wealth and income inequality in Rappahannock County can be used politically to increase some of the state funding for our community?
I don't know if maybe we need to give Keith a rest, but it did sound to me listening to him that in some of these at-risk add-ons, the free and reduced lunch student is in fact a trigger or a threshold question. And that, I don't know if Dr. Grimsley's still on this call, but we have a fairly high percentage of our students who qualify for free and reduced meals. So there may be a connection there where we can pay attention to those kind of small, but someone has already mentioned 200,000 to us is a lot of money. If there are at-risk add-ons that get triggered by free and reduced meals, we may have an opportunity there that we could pursue.
Yeah, I actually talked to Dr. Grimsley about this earlier. You know, that is certainly the more funding streams that you can move from the LCI to the at-risk add-on will help because, you know, if you had, there are a lot of very affluent school divisions that have very small percentages of poverty. Most rural school divisions have significant pockets of poverty where that would impact. Oftentimes in rural communities, you guys know as I do, there's also a lot of pride in rural communities, and families oftentimes won't fill out the application that makes them eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And so that was another strategy that we used in Norton is we really did a campaign to try to get the families that we knew would qualify that hadn't applied to apply, because number one, it helps the families and takes the burden of paying for lunch and breakfast off of their plate. But at the end of the day too, it also helps the division because there's more funding, not only from the state level, but also from the federal level through Title I. But I will tell you also, going back to the LCI, Dr. Grimsley and I also had another conversation. I think there is something to be said, and if you take the suggestion that Ms. Donahue added about putting a minimum, we did that with the enrollment loss funding. There was also a minimum amount of money that would go to each school division. But there's a conversation to be had about the property values that you guys have that aren't taxable. And I think the same model that the coalition has of combining together with it, and I think Shannon's probably already working on this with some other counties that have that same problem. Rappahannock telling Richmond that they have that issue is probably not a very large voice, but if there's 3 or 4 or 5 other localities that have that same issue, you may get some traction.
Thanks, Keith. And I know Dr. Grimsley had a question, so I just went ahead and unmuted her. Dr. Grimsley.
Yes, and Keith teed that up actually perfectly, and I will just tee that back to you that I'm a big fan of Keith's as well. And you've had some time on the floor at the General Assembly. So my question is really about what you sort of queued up for me there. So I know we can band with a few other districts that have this anomalous kind of condition with the local composite index and our property values and the county's taxation setup and things. Now, 3 or 4 counties may have a bigger voice, but when all 3 or 4 counties make up about, 2,000 students, I mean, the voice in Richmond may not be that large still. So I'm wondering what are the chances of maybe partnering with COSARS or getting a stronger voice around that inequitable issue that affects just a few of us, but it's a profound issue when it comes to our local budgeting structure. If there was some method to maybe AGI disparity between school communities and the demographic in the county, what are the chances that the state might do some sort of a supplemental appropriation for those several counties? And would COSARS be willing to maybe work with us a little bit on that?
Shannon, I think that's what COSARS was built for. That exact issue, those anomalies that small and rural school divisions have. I mean, the LCI, the numbers game also affects you guys. I mentioned how the LCI is computed. The fact that you have a small population and a small enrollment, that also plays into those property values as well. And so I think that would be a great issue for our coalition to take up next year. And I bet that there's probably more than 4 or 5 school divisions that are dealing with that. You know, we 7 school divisions talking about enrollment loss became such a big issue that we actually ended up having a private meeting with the Speaker of the House, which is how that work got done. And I think just drawing attention to it, you know, maybe writing an op-ed and having the right people read that, I think there's certainly some potential there. And I think our coalition would love to take that on as a potential issue for next school year.
Excellent. Just tell me when the meeting is. I'll be there.
All right.
All righty. I have one more question. So the academic performance gap between students in poverty and their peers has been pretty well documented, including the fact that rural students in poverty are particularly disadvantaged. Are there any special state funding sources that address this issue? And if so, could they be a source of additional state revenue for our community? Don't all jump at once.
Well, on this one, I suspect there's only one person on this screen that might know the answer. If anyone else does, by all means, jump in. But once again, Dr. Perigin, any thoughts on that one?
We don't have much to do in Southwest Virginia, so I just crunched numbers from the state levels. Now, yeah, there actually are a couple of accounts. At-risk add-on is one of those. The prevention, intervention, and remediation account is another that's funding like that. Most of those dollars come from the federal through Title I, which again goes back to my point about making sure that families who qualify for free or reduced price lunch apply for it, because that is a big funding stream and availability. There are grants that are associated with that too, but you know, without having the applications, those funding models are already there. What our coalition is trying to do is try to get more emphasis placed on those, because you know, rural school divisions, all 80 of us have significant poverty in our school divisions.
I see that we're just about to 8:30, but I also see that we still have 40 participants on this call, which suggests either you don't have anything else to do tonight or you're actually interested in this conversation. I'm going to go with the second. So we're going to continue to take some questions. Brittany, do you have anything left in the chat box? Do we need to stir
I do
up some
not.
more?
I do not. We hit it just on time at 8:30, so I went through all the questions we had.
This would be a good time for anyone who's been listening who has a comment or a question. Comments are fine, to indicate that you'd like to have your mic unmuted and say your piece.
Gary, this is Betsy. I'm curious, and this is probably another question for Keith or Dr. Perigin. If he is seeing trend lines that would suggest that there are going to be more groups, more counties like Rappahannock entering into this sort of red territory as far as the LCI goes, if you think about the sort of what's happening in rural America today, or if that there's no way to really project that out in any good way.
Yeah, there really isn't. You know, I think the LCI in Bristol will go up this year because the casinos coming, real estate is selling like hotcakes down here. But it's not just about what's going on locally, it's about how that factors in statewide. And so if we're having a real estate boom in Bristol, but Northern Virginia is also having a real estate boom at the same time, there's probably going to be very little impact. Where you see big changes in one way or the other is whenever your local community is doing something different than the statewide trend. And so I'm very familiar with the trends in Southwest Virginia, but I'm not as familiar with what's going on in the more suburban and urban parts of the state. So we're always holding our breath when the LCIs are released in December, at least I am.
There's pretty strong national data, probably broken down by state and county, but rural areas continue to lose population. Suburban areas continue to gain population. So just the big picture, unless Rappahannock does something different, the trend line of our declining overall population, the increasing relative age of our population, and the decreasing size of our school population, frankly, those were the numbers that caused me to get motivated to begin these conversations, because something has to change. Or 5 to 10 years out, we will not be happy where we end up.
And Gary, I think Casey Eitner had a question or comment, rather. I'm not sure, I'm unmuting now.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. So I've gotten really intensely interested in the funding side of things, going back to the beginning of Tim Carrington's presentation. And I looked at open space and I looked at the LCI. But recently I've gotten my hands on every home sale in the county over the last 2 years. And I've started to compare the price they sold at with the assessment. And I'm about halfway through it, but there's some preliminary conclusions. When you look at homes over $1 million that were sold in Rappahannock County in the last 2 years, they sold for 31% more than what they were assessed at. And if you take land use into account, that was 46% more than what they were assessed at, which translates to somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 in taxes per home not paid. So think about that. That number continues to follow that same trend as I'm getting into homes under $1 million and homes under $500,000. So we definitely have an issue. And I know we've got an assessment coming up next year, but folks are just not paying the taxes that they should be paying relative to the actual value of their properties. And, you know, when you look at that, we've created a perfect model for wealthy older folks to come and live here. If you were to buy $1.5 million home in Great Falls, you'd pay twice as much tax as you do here, give or take. And the number gets even bigger when you're coming from Bethesda or Chevy Chase or Georgetown, because on top of that, you get the great benefit of lower state taxes. So
Am I the only one that lost Casey?
No, I think we've lost his.
I lost Casey years ago.
Let's see if we
cannot
can get him
hear
back.
audio.
But that's a very good point. There have been studies that a couple of us have been looking at, and I don't want to frighten anyone, but when you read the data, if it's correct, and I'm not saying it is, we really need, as Betsy said, we really need to do our homework and look at this stuff in detail and find experts to help us. But if the first glance at this set of numbers is accurate, the conclusion is, no, you're back.
So look, I mean, the conclusion is straightforward. Property tax, when all is said and done, is really the only source of funds to support these schools. And we've created the perfect model for people to pay really low taxes compared to living anywhere else. And then that number gets even worse, better for them, worse for our schools when there's conservation easement and land use. So you can live on a mountaintop retreat in your own private forest and carp about people not being able to live in lower income homes and pay less taxes than your average Joe in Amosville pays. So I propose that we put together, that the Board of Supervisors put together a property tax commission to look into this, roll up their sleeves and look at this much more realistically. Because every time a wealthy family moves in here, and between their property value and their gross adjusted income in a couple $100,000 or million or whatever, we get further behind in the LCI and how much money we get from the state. These things are all connected. And I, for one, want to see young people living here, and I want to see young children getting educated out here. And I'm willing to pay more taxes to do it. Thank you for hearing me.
Important contribution to this conversation. I was just going to add that the data we're beginning to look at, in addition to everything you said, And I have read nothing that would challenge that. On top of it, it is heartbreaking to think that the parents of children in our schools disproportionately carry the burden for paying for services, including their kids' schooling in Rappahannock, by which I mean that we have an extraordinarily regressive tax system, not necessarily intentionally, but because of a number of factors when they come together. Someone who is not particularly well off, living in a more modest home, these studies seem to suggest, and as I said, we need to nail down the facts before we take any strong position on this, but they suggest that it's skewed to benefit the wealthy against middle class and working class, especially families of children, and particularly single parent households. So we need to look at this more carefully. But I agree with the last comment. It doesn't do any good, Dr. Perigin has said, let's not whine. Let's roll up our sleeves, do some digging, get the facts, and then begin to have a conversation and see where it goes. But this is clearly, if we're going to be serious about looking 5-10 years out, that's certainly one of the directions we have to be serious about investigating. Other comments, other questions?
Happy to sit in a committee and do the hard work, data together.
Ron, did you have your hand up? I saw a glove appear on your screen.
He's saying no.
That was an approving.
Oh, that was a thumbs up.
That was a.
All right. One hand clapping, whatever. Other comments, other questions?
We have one more in the chat, Gary, that I'd like to get to, if that's okay.
Sure.
One of the questions is, does being part of the DC metropolitan statistical area hurt our options for public funding here in Rappahannock? Curious if anyone here knows the answer to that.
I might. So there are federal dollars set aside for small rural schools. Bristol does not qualify for that because we get lumped into the Tri-Cities area, which you guys, that's Bristol, Kingsport, and Johnson City. Johnson City and Kingsport are both in Tennessee. And because of that, us and Washington County and Scott County, Virginia, even though I don't know if you've ever been to Scott or Washington County, that's about as rural as you can get. They don't qualify for that federal funding because they get lumped into that metropolitan area. I bet by the description that you just made, I bet Rappahannock does not get the small rural school assistant money either.
Thank you, Dr. Perigin. And I think, Eve, were you trying to ask a question?
Well, actually, I wanted to ask Rosa to describe, as she did to me on the phone this afternoon, how the district went about achieving some additional money from the state a number of years ago. But I don't know if she hears me and is willing to come on and talk about that experience.
I just saw her unmute. Rosa, are you there?
I am here. I'm unmuted. I'd be glad to talk about that. I kind of feel like we're so close to the end of this evening that it almost deserves its own discussion. In brief, we went to the legislature about 12, 13, 14 years ago, Shannon, and we were able in one legislative session, despite predictions that we'd never get it done, we were able to secure some funding relief in the that allowed us to essentially to piggyback on the Madison LCI, and we did that. I think it's a matter of shared services, and so something called the Madison Agreement exists, and it's a 15-year term, and that is coming towards we're reaching year 15 in a few. I would say the most important aspects of that were that the Board of Supervisors and the school board worked cooperatively. And we were, the legislators commented on that repeatedly when we were in Richmond. And the other thing that, there were several other things that made it possible to do that. One was that we had a skilled county administrator who pointed us to an excellent lobbyist. And we would not have been able to accomplish that in one session without somebody who really knew how the legislature worked. The other thing that we had going for us was a shared grant writer position funded in part by Headwaters and in part by the county. And it was more than a grant writer. This was somebody who was very skilled at research and understood our community and was able to provide the support to the county administrator and the two boards so that we could move through that process very strategically. But I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the two boards working cooperatively. Just put aside your differences and work cooperatively. And to quote a school board colleague of mine, Aline Johnson, she would always say, working together. And I have to say, that is really the main thing, working together.
Rosa, while you're still with us, if I recall, that was not an insubstantial add-on. $250,000 for us is not chump change.
Right, that's right, about 250,000 in additional aid. And yeah.
Over 15 years.
The other thing was the creativity of you folks who found a way to use an existing legislative tool of cooperation between counties on services. And as I recall, having just glanced recently at that, it seems like there was a transportation issue or general services issue that you combined your efforts with Madison's folks, and it was sufficient to convince the legislature or committee that we qualified for this special kind of assistance, which ended up benefiting the schools.
Yeah, I actually don't remember exactly how that transportation question worked. It involved our sharing services, offering some services to Madison students, and in turn we were able to take our students there. Shannon may be able to comment on how it's working now, but that was not entirely our idea. It was a matter of going to the legislature and they're helping us figure out how to do that.
Yeah, if you'd like me to, I can expound on that just a little bit. The Madison agreement is still in place. We are in year 12 of that agreement. It was at one time 250,000. I think it's down to about 110 at this point, based on Madison's LCI and the supplemental basic aid line. And we still have that. It has been modified over the years, dependent upon available service models and agreements we have with Madison. We still have slots available for cosmetology and other CTE programs. Anna Graham, the superintendent in Madison, and I have modified it to not be so specific about a program, but made it more about career and technical slots. So it wasn't just so specific that students can take advantage of. Most commonly, our building trades and culinary are the ones Madison students want to participate in, and cosmetology and CNA has been the one most requested over in Madison. So that's still in place. We share, we also send over a visiting teacher to do educational and sociological testing for special education services for Madison as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? You must be taking me at my word. I look at my watch and we are at 8:45. So one last opportunity before we say good evening. I again want to thank especially Dr. Perigin, who is an outsider, but who has, as you saw tonight, brought us a wealth of information and experience. And we're so pleased that he was able and willing to come and participate with us here in Rappahannock County, sharing his expertise and wisdom. To Tim and to Miranda and Betsy and Debbie, again, thank you so much. We know you're all busy people, and on behalf of Headwaters and on behalf of the community, the students, the families that benefit from any progress we make, and all the folks who are on this call. Those of you who just joined us this evening, and those of you who've been with us for 3 nights, thank you all so much. This is not the end. This is a beginning of understanding better the challenges and the opportunities of quality education, its place in our community, and what it all means to us. And I think we have learned from these conversations. I hope so. I have. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a most pleasant evening. Good night.